would think you'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of people even know Southern Hills exists. For the people that do, they probably see it from Wall Street when they drive by. And so what they see are the backsides of a couple of really dilapidated buildings. And so they think it's a ghost town, it's dilapidated, you know, it's falling apart, which all of those are actually kind of true. But that was once a really vibrant, fun, kind of a cool place to live, especially for students with young families and things like that. Why would university housing allow buildings to get that old and dilapidated and not do something about it? At one time it was a very popular and sought after community, and now we practically can't give it away. So. You're now, 6 years away from Southern Hills having been open. That's why there's no recent memory among students of what that place was, where you go back 15 years, you're going to find a whole population of folks that lived out there. Looking at the grounds out there and how the buildings were laid out, what's around those buildings, it's obvious to me that they were meant for families. They really were built in two phases between 1958 and 1962. So if we opened to the first residents in 59, that tells me we probably opened the second phase in 62. But that's a very common time across the country that family-style housing was built, okay? You had a lot of folks coming back from wars, and there were a lot of incentives for people to go to school, and a lot of campuses really blossomed in the 60s and early 70s. And that's just when a lot of the construction took place. And so I'm sure there was a population of veterans and people of that same age group that had young families, and they needed a good place to stay in community with like folks to be able to successfully go to school. And I'm sure that's what the original intent was. There's playground equipment scattered throughout that area. There was a community garden on the far west side of the property, which is really cool. There's a wall out there that mimics like a drive-in movie screen, and it's on a hill, and so you could tell where people would gather on the hill and watch movies being shown at dusk, I'm sure, and I'm sure the kids that lived out there really got into that. And then just some trails and some other things that are out there show me that was once a really vibrant, fun, kind of a cool place to live, especially for students with young families and things like that. Knowing that the property migrated to graduate students is probably a recognition that by today's standards, those apartments are small. That's the size that they are, where back in the day, people would have thought they were great because they would have been bigger than a trailer, and they would have been nice brick and mortar and nice bathrooms and nice little kitchens in them and things like that. It's just, you follow the market and provide what's needed, and those are the kinds of things we do. Families first, we'll always have room for families. The graduate students and undergrads then kind of fill in the other spaces. I could still fill it with grad students all day long if the buildings were still viable. We just reached a point where the buildings wore out. I mean, that's just all there is to it. It's just the recognition that it's at the end of its life cycle. It got us to where we needed to be. In fact, I would dare say in the mid-50s, when the conversations were happening about planning those buildings, they weren't thinking about those buildings lasting to the year 2000 and beyond. And we use them past the year 2000. We use them well past. That's a very long, healthy life on buildings that weren't made to last that long, for sure, right? When people like myself, directors of housing, are doing their long-range forecasting and we are talking about building new building, that is absolutely part of the planning process. Is how long do we want this building to last? Like, the very first conversation you have is, what's the death of the building? Which is kind of a strange thing to do, but then everything else is planned around that. If I had the resources, I absolutely would tear them down. I would send them on their way and give them a pleasant farewell, but it's just not in the cards right now with enrollment and occupancy the way it is. We have 40% of the revenue that we had just 4 years ago, and so I'm not going to take those precious dollars and put them into destruction. I'm going to put them into construction, meaning good communities and keeping up the buildings that we are using, and those buildings will have to wait until better times for us to really do something about them ultimately.
You know, I've been here 22 years, and when I came here in '96, this place was full of people. I mean, it's full. There was very rarely an empty apartment down here.
Yeah.
It's just changed so much. It's just, you know, and this all happened, that stairwell fell last summer. I think that one down there that's about to go, where it ties into the big upright iron, it's all just a big old ball of flake and rust.
Wow.
It's kind of an example of what Mother Nature does when you just let places go. This building actually, if I'm not mistaken, this was the first building closed down here. And you're probably going back 10, 12 years now that this building's been closed. I think this was the first one. So.
I think there was quite a population of people that lived there where they were SIU students that lived there, and it allowed them to successfully go to school, get their degree, and get on with life. But you've got another generation of people that grew up there, right? So for 2 to 5 or 6 years of their life, they may have lived there as children, right? And so that's their memory. And I know that's true because I lived on a college campus when my father went back to school in the early 70s, and I remember that vividly. And there is a population of people who have those same memories that I do, only they're here in our buildings as opposed to where I was with my dad in Michigan. And so things like that will live on in certain lore. But then you have a population of grad students that lived out there. So there was probably a fair amount of shenanigans that were going on out there, you know. There's probably some stories of some great parties in the woods and, you know, things like that, just as there are from every campus that I've ever been on. But, okay, fast forward 40 years, those truly are stories at retirement parties because those people are now in their 60s, right? And, you know, when your friends get together, you know, 20, 30 years down the road, those are the kinds of things that come back. And so the university doesn't have a real formal legacy in place for Southern Hills beyond what's told in our story. But beyond that, you know, the memory of your institution tends to be very short because most of the people that are here are only here for 4 years. There's a life to the residence halls community, just as there is to the building itself. And that community turns over every few years. So you have somebody that comes in as a freshman that learned from the upperclassmen what's cool, what's not cool. So you become the sophomore and the junior and you move on. Well, your interests may have changed in that time frame, and so what you were teaching the freshmen a couple years later is a lot different than what you learned as a freshman, you know, and the building cycle just kind of flips over every so often, right? I believe there was an announcement that was made sometime between 2000 and 2006-ish that we are going to close Southern Hills and we're going to move on with other things. And there was such an outcry from graduate students and the graduate school, from what I understand, that actually became a 5-year phase-out plan rather than just closing the buildings off. So that tells you something about the students that were living there. They really had a great experience. And I go into some of those buildings where those students lived, and it was, you know, circa 1980s at best in terms of the decor and things. And so there was something about it that they loved, and that was great. But the buildings truly were, you know, reaching the end of their life, and it was time to move on. So I don't think it's out of the question that every now and then you see a tent popped up out there or something. Again, they're not supposed to be out there, and I'm not condoning it, but I'm sure it happens because it's kind of a cool place, right? For the same reason that somebody goes out to touch of nature, it's just a cool thing to do and hang out out there. So it is still serving somewhat of a purpose. There's 3 or 4 buildings out there that we're still using as shops for some of our trades folks. So our plumbers are out there, our carpenters are out there, and then we use the rooms on the upper floors for storage. I would like to see housing out there, but you know, it's not unheard of too that if the university really wanted to kind of circle its wagons and focus just on the core of campus, that whole part of campus could be sold off at some point, and that money used to, you know, focus on the inner core of campus. The train tracks create a great barrier that if some private developer wanted to go in there and do something, there's probably hundreds of acres out there to work with that somebody could potentially work with. So it's hard to say, you know, it is kind of out there a ways in today's standards of what's going on for our students, but who knows 5 years from now what the need on campus might be and what kinds of things we might want to look at for that area. So that's when you say, well, okay, what else can we do?